He called himself the Groom, but the men hanging from the gymnasium ceiling knew him by a different name. Some whispered it in the shadows of Mount Massive Asylum. Others screamed it before the surgical saw started. Eddie Gluskin, a name that became a legend inside the walls of a place where monsters were made, not born. Tonight we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing antagonists in horror gaming history. A man who turned the vocational block into his own twisted wedding chapel. A killer who sang love songs while committing unspeakable acts. This is the complete story of Eddie Gluskin, from the childhood abuse that broke him, to the corporate experiments that remade him, to the final moments when he held the hand of the man who would escape the hell he'd created. Before we step into the blood-soaked wedding preparations, you need to understand something crucial about Outlast. This isn't Silent Hill. There's no fog to hide behind. No alternate dimension where your sins manifest as creatures. Outlast is rawer than that, more immediate. The horrors are human, or at least they used to be human before the Murkoff Corporation got their hands on them. Mount Massive Asylum sits deep in the Colorado mountains, far from prying eyes, far from anyone who might ask questions about the screams echoing through the valleys at night. It presents itself as a facility for the criminally insane, a place where society's most dangerous are kept away from the innocent. The reality is far more sinister. Murkoff Corporation didn't just house the mentally ill, they experimented on them. The morphogenic engine, a device that could theoretically control human consciousness, became their obsession. Project Walrider was the end game, an attempt to create something that existed between ghost and living weapon. A nanite swarm controlled by human consciousness that could pass through walls, kill without leaving evidence, and serve as the ultimate tool for corporate espionage and assassination. To achieve this, they needed test subjects, variants they called them, men who were already broken, already violent, already beyond what society considered redeemable, men like Eddie Gluskin. But Eddie's story doesn't begin in Mount Massive. It begins decades earlier, in a childhood that should never have happened. The documents recovered from Mount Massive paint a picture in clinical language, the kind of sterile medical terminology that tries to sanitize horror. Repeated sexual abuse by father and uncle, photographic documentation of assault, trauma consistent with long-term victimization. Behind those words is a child who learned that the people meant to protect him were the ones who hurt him most. Eddie's father and uncle didn't just abuse him. They documented it, took photographs as if they were proud of what they were doing, as if the destruction of a child's innocence was something worth preserving. The psychological impact was catastrophic and irreversible. When you're that young, when the abuse is that systematic, something fundamental breaks inside you. Your understanding of love becomes warped. Your sense of safety evaporates. Your perception of yourself, of your body, of what relationships mean, all of it gets twisted into shapes that can never be straightened again. Eddie's mind did what traumatized minds often do. It created defenses. It built walls. And when the walls weren't enough, it started rewriting history entirely. According to the psychological evaluations conducted before his arrival at Mount Massive, Eddie had constructed an elaborate false memory. He rejected his actual childhood completely, refused to acknowledge it even when confronted with photographic evidence. Instead, he'd built a new past based on the 1950s sitcom Leave It to Beaver. In his reconstructed memories, he had a loving father, a caring mother, a wholesome American upbringing filled with moral lessons and family dinners. The perfect nuclear family, the exact opposite of what he'd actually endured. When doctors showed him the photographs of his abuse, actual documentation of the crimes committed against him, Eddie would become violent, not because he didn't believe them, but because accepting them meant accepting that his entire constructed reality was a lie. This defense mechanism, this complete rejection of traumatic reality in favor of manufactured nostalgia, became the foundation of everything Eddie would later become. He didn't just want to forget his past, he wanted to replace it entirely with something wholesome, something that matched the television version of American life he'd absorbed. The perfect family, the perfect wife, the perfect life. And when reality refused to provide those things, Eddie decided he would create them himself, no matter what it took. As Eddie moved into young adulthood, the cracks in his psyche became impossible to hide. The abuse he'd suffered as a child had taught him that bodies were objects to be used, that intimacy was inseparable from violence, that women existed as targets for his confused rage and warped desire. He became a serial killer, though the full extent of his crimes before Mount Massive remains partially obscured. What we know comes from fragments in his psychological file and references in the documents scattered throughout the vocational block. Eddie didn't just kill women, he mutilated them. He raped them. He attempted to physically alter them, cutting and reshaping their bodies in ways that suggested he was trying to create something, trying to force reality to match the image in his head of what the perfect woman should be. Even then, before the morphogenic engine amplified his delusions to supernatural levels, Eddie was trying to manufacture an ideal that existed only in his damaged imagination: the perfect bride, the perfect wife, the perfect partner who would give him the perfect family he'd convinced himself he deserved. The details of his capture aren't fully documented in the game's materials, but eventually law enforcement caught up with him. Given the severity of his crimes and his obvious mental deterioration, he was deemed criminally insane. A court committed him to Mount Massive Asylum, where he was supposed to receive treatment for his violent, misogynistic pathology. In any other facility, that's what would have happened: therapy, medication, containment. But Mount Massive wasn't interested in treating Eddie Gluskin. They saw something else in him: potential. The Murkoff Corporation had been searching for candidates suitable for their morphogenic engine experiments. They needed subjects with certain psychological profiles, minds that were already fractured in specific ways that made them susceptible to the engine's influence. Eddie's combination of childhood trauma, constructed false memories, violent obsessions, and complete disconnection from consensus reality made him an ideal test subject. He wasn't a patient to be cured. He was raw material to be refined. The morphogenic engine itself is a nightmare of corporate ambition married to pseudoscience. Imagine a device that looks like it was designed by someone who'd read about electroshock therapy and MRI machines and torture implements and decided to combine all three. The subject is strapped in, immobilized, exposed to electromagnetic fields and sensory deprivation and substances that break down the barriers between conscious and unconscious mind. The stated goal was to make human consciousness controllable, to create a link between mind and machine that would allow Murkoff to literally program human behavior. What it actually did was take whatever was broken in a person's mind and amplify it, magnify it, turn psychological damage into something so overwhelming that reality itself became negotiable. Variants who went through the engine didn't just become more of what they already were, they became living embodiments of their own psychosis, empowered by the engine's alterations to impose their delusions on the world around them. Chris Walker, who believed he was protecting his fellow patients, became a superhuman killer convinced everyone was a threat. Richard Traeger, obsessed with Murkoff's experiments, became a torture enthusiast who treated mutilation as science, and Eddie Gluskin, who'd spent years trying to create the perfect family through violence, became the Groom. The transformation wasn't instant. Eddie went through multiple sessions with the morphogenic engine, each one documented in progress reports that treated his psychological disintegration as data points. The reports note increased fixation on marriage and domestic life, heightened aggression when questioned about his past, complete rejection of any narrative that contradicted his false memories, and most significantly, a growing belief that his desires weren't just wishes, but destinies that reality would eventually accommodate. The engine didn't cure Eddie. It told him he was right. It validated every delusion, reinforced every broken thought pattern, and gave him the physical and mental capabilities to pursue his obsessions without limit. By the time Wayland Park encountered Eddie in the underground lab at the beginning of Whistleblower, the transformation was nearly complete. Wayland, a software engineer who'd been hired by Murkoff to help develop their systems, had discovered what the corporation was really doing. He'd seen the variants, understood that Project Walrider was built on human suffering, and made the decision to expose it all. He sent an email to journalist Miles Upshur, the protagonist of the main Outlast game, providing the tip that would bring Miles to Mount Massive, and then Murkoff security caught him. They didn't kill Wayland, they imprisoned him, threw him in a holding cell in the underground lab where the most intensive experiments were conducted. And that's where he saw Eddie Gluskin for one of the first times, though neither man knew how important that moment would become. Eddie was being led past Wayland's cell, restrained, agitated, and he locked eyes with the imprisoned engineer. What happened next depends on whose account you trust, but the moment is preserved in the game's opening. Eddie was terrified. Despite everything the morphogenic engine had done to him, despite the delusions and the enhanced strength and the complete mental break from reality, some part of Eddie understood he was being destroyed. He begged Wayland for help. He pleaded with him to stop what was happening, to expose Murkoff, to do something. And Wayland, trapped behind bars and facing his own uncertain fate, could only watch as security led Eddie away for another session with the machine. That failure, that moment of helplessness, would haunt their later encounter. The Mount Massive incident, as it would later be called, began when Billy Hope, the host for Project Walrider, died. The nanite swarm escaped containment, and with it went Murkoff's control over the entire facility. The Walrider tore through security personnel. Containment systems failed across multiple blocks, and the variants, including Eddie Gluskin, broke free. In the chaos that followed, as staff evacuated or died and the asylum descended into violence, Eddie made his way to the vocational block. The vocational block was where Mount Massive's inmates were supposed to learn skills: woodworking, metalworking, basic trades that might help them reintegrate into society if they were ever deemed fit for release. It had workshops and industrial equipment, sewing machines and power tools, everything needed to create things. For Eddie Gluskin, fresh from the morphogenic engine and fully lost in his delusion of becoming the Groom, it was perfect. He claimed the entire wing as his own, and over the days and weeks that followed, he transformed it into his personal wedding venue. What Eddie created in the vocational block was a grotesque parody of romantic preparation. He'd set up a workshop that looked like a tailor's studio, with mannequins and wedding dresses and sewing equipment. He'd created living quarters that mimicked a honeymoon suite, complete with candles and carefully arranged furniture. And he'd established the gymnasium as his gallery, a place to display his work. Dozens of bodies hung from the ceiling, each one a failed bride, each one a man Eddie had captured and surgically altered in his attempts to create the perfect woman. The scale of Eddie's killing spree is staggering. Approximately 55 rope pulleys hang from the gymnasium ceiling alone, each one holding a mutilated corpse. Additional bodies are scattered throughout the vocational block in various states of surgical alteration. The total death count likely exceeds 70 victims, possibly approaching 100. What makes this number even more disturbing is the timeline. Eddie had been free in the vocational block for approximately 24 to 36 hours before Wayland encountered him. This means he was killing, surgically altering, and displaying multiple victims per hour during his rampage, a pace of violence that defies comprehension. The surgeries Eddie performed were nightmarish. Working with whatever tools the vocational block provided, crude instruments meant for woodworking and metalworks rather than medical procedures, he would attempt to physically transform his male victims into women, breasts crudely sewn onto torsos, genitals removed and relocated, bodies mutilated and rearranged according to Eddie's warped understanding of female anatomy. None of them survived the process. How could they? Eddie wasn't a surgeon. He was a serial killer with power tools and a delusion strong enough to override basic reality. But that didn't stop him from trying again and again, convinced that eventually he'd get it right. Eventually he'd create a bride, perfect enough to give him the family he deserved. The other variants in Mount Massive learned quickly to fear the Groom. Stories spread through the asylum about the man in the vocational block who sang old love songs while working, who called his victims darling and sweetheart, even as he cut into them, who believed he was preparing for the happiest day of his life. Some variants tried to appease him, offering him potential brides, pushing weaker inmates toward the vocational block in hopes Eddie would be satisfied and leave them alone. It worked sometimes. Eddie's reputation became so fearsome that even Chris Walker, the massive former military officer who'd become Mount Massive's apex predator, seemed to avoid his territory. But Eddie wasn't satisfied. None of his brides were perfect. None of them lasted. None of them could give him what he wanted, which was something impossible, a fantasy that existed only in black and white television, and his reconstructed memories of a childhood that never happened. He kept trying, kept capturing, kept cutting, kept singing, and the bodies in the gymnasium kept accumulating, testament to his persistence and his complete inability to understand why reality refused to accommodate his dreams. Then Wayland Park entered the vocational block, and Eddie Gluskin saw possibility again. Wayland's journey through Mount Massive had been brutal. After the Walrider's escape, he'd been forgotten in his cell, left to either die or find his own way out. He'd managed to escape the underground lab, navigating through sections of the asylum that were now completely lawless, populated by variants and the occasional desperate security guard. He'd survived Dennis, a patient with multiple personalities who deliberately herded him toward the vocational block while laughing about what awaited him there. By the time Wayland climbed through a window and found himself in Eddie's territory, he was exhausted, terrified, and running on pure survival instinct. The vocational block announced itself gradually. First came the signs, handwritten notes in Eddie's careful script welcoming his darling, asking her to be patient, promising that everything would be perfect. Then came the evidence of his work, blood stains and surgical tools, wedding dresses on mannequins, romantic music playing from somewhere deeper in the building. Wayland found documents, progress reports on Eddie Gluskin that explained some of his history, that revealed the extent of the morphogenic engine's alterations, and he found the bodies. Not the gymnasium yet, that came later, but enough scattered evidence to understand that whoever controlled this section of the asylum was far more dangerous than the random violence Waylon had encountered elsewhere. Then he heard the singing. I want a girl, just like the girl that married dear old Dad. Eddie's voice carried through the halls, pleasant and tuneful, completely at odds with the horror surrounding it. The song was from 1911, a sentimental piece about a man seeking a wife who embodies old-fashioned domestic virtues. Eddie sang it constantly, his own twisted anthem, a promise and a threat wrapped in nostalgia for an era that never actually existed the way he imagined it. Their first direct encounter came when Eddie found Waylon hiding. He didn't run, he didn't chase. He walked with measured confidence, smiling, speaking in a tone that would have been appropriate for greeting a date. He called Waylon darling. He explained that he'd been waiting, that he knew she would come eventually, that they were going to be so happy together. The fact that Waylon was obviously male didn't matter to Eddie. In his post-engine delusion, reality was whatever he needed it to be. Waylon would become his bride. The surgery would take care of the details, and then they'd have their perfect life together. Waylon ran. Eddie pursued, but not frantically. He strolled after his intended, confident that eventually she'd tire, eventually she'd understand, eventually she'd accept her role in his fantasy. He called out endearments and threats in equal measure, his tone never quite shifting from cheerful even when he was describing what he planned to do. This was foreplay in Eddie's mind, a romantic chase before the inevitable union. The terror Waylon felt was just pre-wedding jitters. Everything would be fine once they were married. The vocational block became a hunting ground where the predator never stopped smiling. Waylon navigated through workshops filled with the evidence of Eddie's obsession, past rooms where surgical equipment had been arranged with disturbing care, through corridors where that constant singing echoed from directions impossible to pinpoint. Eddie wasn't just searching for him, he was courting him, leaving gifts and notes, creating obstacles that forced Waylon deeper into his territory, orchestrating the entire experience like some perverse romantic comedy where the punchline was mutilation. The gymnasium revelation came when Waylon, seeking a way forward, opened a door and found himself standing beneath dozens of hanging corpses. They swayed slightly in the air currents, bodies that had been surgically altered, failed attempts at transformation that Eddie had preserved like trophies or warnings or both. Some still wore the remnants of wedding dresses Eddie had sewn onto them. Others had been posed in ways that suggested Eddie had tried to arrange them as if they were still alive, still capable of the domestic partnership he craved. The smell was overwhelming. The visual impact was worse. This wasn't just murder. This was systematic delusion made flesh, the physical manifestation of a mind so broken that it had inverted every normal human instinct about love and partnership into this carnival of death. Waylon documented what he could with his camcorder, the same device that had recorded so much horror already during his escape attempt. Part of him understood that this evidence mattered, that if he survived, the world needed to know what Murkoff had created, but another part, the part focused purely on survival, just wanted to find the exit and never think about Mount Massive or Eddie Gluskin or any of this ever again. The problem was that Eddie controlled all the roads forward. Every path that led toward potential escape passed through areas he'd claimed, rooms he'd prepared, traps he'd set. The pursuit through the vocational block showcased Eddie's particular brand of horror. Unlike Chris Walker, who was pure brutal force, or Richard Traeger, who was sadistic experimentation, Eddie was romantic obsession weaponized. He genuinely believed he was wooing Waylon, that everything he did was part of a courtship ritual. When he finally caught Waylon, Dragging him to the workshop where surgical equipment waited, Eddie's demeanor was tender. He explained what he was going to do in terms that sounded like he was discussing wedding plans. He'd make Waylon perfect. He'd fix the imperfections. They'd be so happy together, just like in his memories of the childhood that never was. The family life he'd constructed from television reruns and desperation. The surgery table was surrounded by candles. Eddie had music playing. He'd arranged the space like he imagined a romantic evening should look, except for the restraints and the saws and the blood already staining the floor from previous attempts. As he prepared his tools, Eddie talked about his mother, about his father, about the life they'd built together. The false memories were so real to him now that he spoke about them with absolute conviction. He described family dinners that never happened, gentle lessons that were actually abuse reframed, a wholesome American childhood that existed only in his fractured mind. The morphogenic engine had taken his defensive delusion and made it his entire reality. Waylon managed to escape before the surgery could begin, breaking free through a combination of luck and Eddie's own distraction. The groom had been so focused on explaining his plans, so caught up in the romantic fantasy he was narrating, that he'd given his victim enough time to find an opening. Waylon fled again, deeper into the vocational block, with Eddie's singing following him like a promise that this wasn't over, that the wedding would happen eventually, that destiny couldn't be avoided forever. What followed was a brutal game of cat and mouse through rooms that Eddie had prepared specifically for this. A shower area where he expected his bride to clean up before the ceremony. A dressing room where wedding gowns waited on mannequins. A chapel space that Eddie had constructed from a former cafeteria, complete with improvised altar and seating for guests who would never arrive because everyone else in this section of Mount Massive was either dead or smart enough to stay far away from the groom's territory. Each space revealed more about Eddie's psychology, about the specific nature of his break from reality. He'd created a world that matched the one in his head. The vocational block wasn't just a crime scene. It was Eddie's constructed reality, a place where his delusions could be acted out with no one to contradict them, no doctors to insist he face his actual past, no police to stop the wedding preparations. The other variants avoided him not just because he was dangerous, but because his madness was so specific, so focused, that he barely registered anyone who didn't fit into his narrative. If you weren't a potential bride, you simply didn't exist in Eddie's story. The documents Waylon found scattered through the area painted a fuller picture of what the morphogenic engine had done. Eddie's childhood abuse was detailed in clinical language, the kind that tries to sanitize horror through medical terminology. The psychological evaluations noted his fixation on 1950s domestic imagery and his violent rejection of his actual past. Progress reports tracked his deterioration through multiple engine sessions, noting how his already damaged psyche had been systematically amplified until he existed in a permanent state of delusional certainty. The Murkoff researchers who'd written these documents showed no concern for what they were creating. Eddie was just data, experimental results, a proof of concept that the engine could reshape human consciousness. The fact that they'd turned a traumatized abuse victim into something even more monstrous apparently didn't trouble anyone writing the reports. One document in particular stood out, a psychological evaluation that attempted to explain Eddie's fixation on creating female partners from male victims. The analyst theorized that Eddie's confusion about gender and bodies stemmed from his childhood abuse, that the men who'd violated him had warped his understanding of anatomy, sexuality, and relationships so thoroughly that he couldn't conceptualize partnership in any normal way. The abuse had been same-sex assault, which created complex psychological damage around masculinity, intimacy, and his own body. Eddie's attempt to surgically create women from men was his broken mind's way of trying to separate love from the male violence he'd experienced, trying to manufacture a category of person who could give him affection without triggering his trauma. Of course, this logic was entirely internal and completely insane. The surgery victims were still men being violated by a male aggressor, still people being destroyed by someone who'd learned violence from the men who should have protected him. Eddie had become his abusers, no matter how he tried to frame it. The chase continued through the vocational block's lower levels, through areas that became progressively more flooded as Wayland damaged pipes and infrastructure in his desperate attempts to slow Eddie down. The water rising through the building added new urgency. Eddie's workshop began to flood. His carefully arranged romantic spaces were ruined by cold, dirty water seeping up through the drains. And yet he kept pursuing, kept singing, kept calling out to his darling bride. The physical environment was collapsing around him, but Eddie's delusion was stronger than reality. As long as he believed the wedding would happen, no amount of water or destruction could deter him. Wayland reached the gymnasium again, this time finding a potential route of escape that required him to climb through the infrastructure while Eddie's hanging victims swayed around him. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Wayland literally navigating through the evidence of Eddie's failures while trying not to become the next body on display. Above him, below him, on every side, the corpses testified to what happened when Eddie's fantasies collided with human limitations. None of these men had survived his attempts to transform them. None of them had been perfect enough. None of them had given Eddie what he wanted because what he wanted was impossible. But Eddie never learned from failure. Each botched. Surgery just meant he needed to try again, needed to refine his technique, needed to find a better bride. The accumulation of bodies wasn't evidence that his plan was fundamentally flawed. It was just proof that he hadn't found the right person yet. This is how delusion sustains itself, by reframing every failure as a temporary setback rather than a fundamental error in thinking. The morphogenic engine had removed Eddie's ability to self-correct, to learn from experience, to recognize patterns. He was locked in an eternal loop of hope and disappointment and renewed hope, unable to understand that the perfect wife he sought existed only in black and white television shows and the false memories he'd constructed to protect himself from unbearable truth. The theological dimension of Eddie's delusion also became apparent through scattered notes and his own rambling monologues. He spoke about purity and sin, about making things right, about God's plan for him. Despite everything he did, every murder and mutilation and violation, Eddie saw himself as righteous. The 1950s imagery he'd absorbed wasn't just aesthetic. It came with the moral framework of that era, at least as it had been presented in sanitized television. Men were providers and protectors. Women were homemakers and mothers. Marriage was sacred. Family was everything. Eddie had absorbed this value system and twisted it into justification for his crimes. He was preparing for a holy union. The surgeries were acts of creation, like God shaping Eve from Adam's rib. The violence was necessary because nothing perfect comes without sacrifice. This moral dimension made Eddie more disturbing than a simple sadist. Richard Traeger enjoyed causing pain for its own sake, found pleasure in the suffering of others. Eddie genuinely believed he was doing something good, something necessary, something that would lead to happiness for everyone involved. His victims weren't people he wanted to hurt. They were raw material that needed reshaping, partners who just didn't understand yet how perfect things would be once the transformation was complete. This made him impossible to reason with. You couldn't appeal to his conscience because his conscience was telling him he was right. You couldn't negotiate because he saw any resistance as temporary confusion that would clear up once the wedding happened. Wayland's escape from the vocational block required him to damage the building's infrastructure so severely that it began to collapse. Pipes burst, floods accelerated, and structural supports groaned under stress they weren't designed to handle. Eddie pursued through all of it, wading through rising water, climbing over debris, his wedding suit getting progressively more ruined, but his smile never faltering. The building was falling apart around him, and he treated it like minor inconvenience rather than existential threat. His reality was internal now, sustained by delusion rather than sensory input. Physical facts, like flooding and structural collapse, registered only as obstacles to be overcome, not warnings to be heeded. The final confrontation came in an area that had become almost completely flooded, with Wayland struggling through chest-deep water while Eddie stalked after him with that same measured pace. The groom explained, in tones of infinite patience, that this was all unnecessary. Why was she running? Didn't she understand how happy they'd be? Everything was prepared. The ceremony was ready. All Wayland had to do was stop fighting destiny and accept the love Eddie was offering. The fact that this love came with surgical mutilation and certain death apparently wasn't relevant to Eddie's calculations. But then something shifted. Whether it was the physical stress of the pursuit, the psychological strain of repeated failure, or some small crack in the morphogenic engine's conditioning, Eddie began to break down. His confidence wavered. His singing became less assured. The delusion that had sustained him through dozens of failed surgeries started showing fractures, though it never fully collapsed. Even at the end, he remained convinced that perfection had been possible, that they could have achieved something beautiful if only circumstances had been different. The final confrontation came in the flooded gymnasium where Eddie had displayed his failures. Wayland, exhausted and injured, found himself caught. Eddie, believing his bride had finally stopped running, attempted to hang Wayland from one of the pulley systems where so many bodies already swayed. He secured the noose, activated the mechanism, and prepared to watch his perfect bride ascend to join the gallery. But Wayland's weight reversed the poorly maintained pulley system. Instead of Wayland rising, Eddie was pulled upward, his own creation turning against him. He was impaled on a metal spike protruding from the gymnasium ceiling, the same space where he'd hung dozens of victims now claiming him. As Eddie died, impaled and bleeding, he reached down toward Wayland with one hand. Wayland, still in the noose but now standing on solid ground as the mechanism had reversed, briefly took Eddie's hand. In his final moments, Eddie whispered words that revealed the tragedy beneath the monster. We could have been beautiful. Not an apology, not recognition of his crimes, just grief for the fantasy that would never be real. Then his hand went slack, and the groom's story ended where it had begun, surrounded by the evidence of his impossible obsession. The deeper truth about Eddie Gluskin extends far beyond the boundaries of the vocational block. To understand what he represents, you need to understand the machinery that created him, the corporate logic that turned human trauma into experimental data, and the broader implications of what Mount Massive Asylum was really doing in those Colorado mountains. The Murkoff Corporation presented itself as a healthcare and research organization, but its actual business model was far more sinister. They specialized in what might be called weaponized psychology, finding ways to turn human consciousness into controllable assets. The morphogenic engine wasn't designed to heal anyone. It was designed to prove that human minds could be reprogrammed. that behavior could be controlled at a fundamental level, that consciousness itself was just another resource to be exploited. Eddie was never a patient in their eyes. He was a test case, raw material to be refined into proof of concept. The documents scattered throughout Mount Massive reveal the cold calculation behind these experiments. Researchers noted Eddie's responses to engine sessions with the same detachment they might use to describe chemical reactions. Increased aggression levels noted and deemed acceptable. Delusional framework stabilizing around domestic imagery. Subjects showing enhanced physical capabilities consistent with morphogenic alterations. There's no concern for Eddie as a person, no acknowledgement that they were taking someone who'd already been destroyed by childhood abuse and systematically making him worse. The only metric that mattered was whether the engine could reshape his consciousness in predictable ways. This raises uncomfortable questions about culpability and victimhood. Eddie Gluskin murdered dozens of people in horrific ways. He tortured them, mutilated them, violated their bodies in pursuit of his impossible fantasy. By any moral or legal standard, he was a monster who caused immense suffering, but he was also someone who'd been victimized twice, first by the family members who abused him as a child, then by the corporation that saw his resulting psychological damage as an opportunity for experimentation. Where does responsibility lie when someone is systematically broken, given false hope through delusional frameworks, and then unleashed on the vulnerable? The game doesn't answer this question cleanly, and that's part of what makes Eddie such a compelling antagonist. He's not a simple villain you can feel good about escaping. He's a tragedy that gained teeth, a victim who became a victimizer, a person whose humanity was stripped away in layers until only the wound remained. The moment when he asks Waylon to stay, when the delusion cracks enough for genuine human connection to emerge, complicates the entire narrative. It doesn't excuse anything Eddie did, but it forces recognition that the monster singing love songs while committing atrocities was manufactured, that he might have been saved if anyone had intervened at the right moment, that his crimes are inseparable from the crimes committed against him. The morphogenic engine's specific effects on Eddie deserve closer examination. Unlike some variants who gained obvious superhuman abilities, Eddie's enhancements were more subtle but no less significant. He demonstrated increased pain tolerance, allowing him to continue pursuing victims even after sustaining injuries that should have been incapacitating. His strength was enhanced enough to overpower adult men easily and to perform crude surgeries that required holding struggling victims down. Most significantly, his capacity for self-delusion became so powerful that reality itself seemed negotiable in his presence. This last effect is the most disturbing because it suggests the engine didn't just change Eddie's brain chemistry or enhance his physical capabilities. It altered his fundamental relationship with reality. When Eddie looked at male victims, he genuinely saw potential brides. When he performed surgeries that were obvious failures to any outside observer, he saw progress toward perfection. When confronted with evidence that contradicted his constructed memories, he simply rejected it without any cognitive dissonance. The engine had essentially given him the ability to impose his internal reality onto the external world, at least within the confines of his own perception. This phenomenon extended to the vocational block itself. The way Eddie had transformed that space into his wedding venue wasn't just physical decoration. It was reality warping through belief made manifest. Other variants avoided the area not just because Eddie was dangerous, but because entering his territory meant entering his delusion. The atmosphere changed when you crossed into his domain. The lighting seemed different, more romantic despite being the same fluorescent fixtures used elsewhere. The music that played seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Even the blood and bodies were arranged in ways that suggested Eddie saw beauty where anyone else would see only horror. Some players and analysts have noted similarities between Eddie and certain real-world serial killers, particularly those whose crimes involved attempts to create idealized partners. Ed Gein, who inspired countless horror characters including Norman Bates and Leatherface, attempted to create a woman suit from his victim's skin. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes involved attempts to create compliant partners through crude lobotomies. These real cases share Eddie's core delusion, the belief that reality can be forced to conform to internal fantasy through violence and violation. The difference is that Eddie had the morphogenic engine amplifying these impulses to supernatural levels, removing any remaining barriers between thought and action. The game's developers have discussed in interviews how they approached Eddie's character design. They wanted to create an antagonist who was genuinely frightening but also tragic, someone whose horror came from recognizable human damage rather than supernatural evil. The decision to make him sing constantly, to have him maintain a pleasant demeanor even while committing atrocities, was intended to create maximum cognitive dissonance for players. Your brain knows this person is dangerous, but the sensory inputs, the singing, and the polite language and the romantic framing contradict that knowledge. This creates a unique flavor of dread that's different from the pure aggression of Chris Walker or the sadistic glee of Richard Traeger. The voice acting contributes significantly to this effect. Eddie's voice actor delivers lines with genuine warmth and tenderness, making his threats sound like promises of devotion. When he calls Waylon darling or talks about how happy they'll be together, there's no sarcasm or obvious menace. He means it. He genuinely believes he's offering something wonderful. This sincerity makes him more disturbing than if he were obviously cruel, because it reveals the depth of his delusion. He's not lying or manipulating. He's completely convinced that surgical mutilation equals love, that forced transformation equals partnership, that his victim should be grateful for the opportunity to become his perfect bride. The setting of the vocational block amplifies Eddie's horror through environmental storytelling. The workshop's filled with domestic imagery, wedding dresses on mannequins, romantic candles everywhere. These details create a grotesque parody of preparation for life's happiest day. Every element that should signify joy and new beginnings is corrupted by the context of blood and bodies and surgical equipment. The game forces you to navigate through this twisted domesticity, past scenes that look like they should be celebrations but are actually crime scenes, through spaces designed for creation that Eddie has repurposed for destruction. The gymnasium filled with hanging corpses represents the culmination of Eddie's delusion. Each body is a failed attempt, a bride who wasn't perfect enough, a partner who couldn't give him what he needed. But instead of recognizing the pattern, instead of understanding that the problem might be his approach rather than the victim's inadequacy, Eddie just keeps trying. The bodies become a gallery of persistence, a testament to his inability to learn from repeated failure. They sway in the air currents, preserved trophies of his attempts to manufacture love through violence. For Waylon, navigating through that space becomes a literal journey through the physical evidence of insanity, surrounded on all sides by what happens when delusion meets flesh. The theological elements in Eddie's characterization deserve attention because they reveal how he's rationalized his actions. He speaks about God's plan, about purity and sin, about making things right. This isn't just window dressing. It's Eddie's attempt to place his crimes within a moral framework that makes sense to him. The 1950s domestic imagery he absorbed came packaged with religious undertones, the assumption that traditional family structures were divinely ordained, that certain roles and relationships were sacred. Eddie has taken this framework and perverted it, convinced himself that his surgical violations are holy acts, that creating the perfect wife is doing God's work. This religious dimension makes Eddie particularly dangerous because it removes any possibility of moral doubt. If he were just a killer indulging perverse desires, he might experience guilt or hesitation. But because he's framed his crimes as divine mission, as fulfilling a sacred destiny, he has no internal restraints. Every murder is justified. Every mutilation is necessary. Every victim who dies screaming is an unfortunate but unavoidable sacrifice on the path to righteousness. The engine didn't create this moral framework, but it amplified it beyond any rational constraint, giving Eddie absolute certainty that he was right. The contrast between Eddie's self-perception and reality creates tragic irony that runs throughout the Whistleblower DLC. He sees himself as a romantic lead, a groom preparing for his wedding day with appropriate care and devotion. The reality is that he's a serial killer in a ruined asylum, surrounded by evidence of his failures, pursuing someone who's terrified of him. He believes he's offering love. He's actually offering death. He thinks he's creating beauty. He's producing nightmares. This gap between perception and reality is where the horror lives, in that space where Eddie's internal narrative and the objective truth have diverged so completely that they no longer share any common ground. The brief contact between Waylon and Eddie at the end complicates the entire dynamic. It would have been easier, more satisfying in conventional narrative terms, if Waylon had simply escaped while Eddie died without acknowledgement. That would provide clear moral resolution. Instead, in the chaos of the reversed pulley system, Waylon briefly took Eddie's dying hand. Whether this was instinctive human compassion, shock, or simply the physical proximity of their positions is left ambiguous. The gesture was momentary, not a choice to stay or comfort, but a fleeting connection between perpetrator and intended victim. This moment doesn't redeem Eddie or excuse his crimes, but it acknowledges the complexity of someone who was both monster and victim of circumstance. This complexity is rare in horror gaming. Most antagonists are presented as pure threats to be overcome, defeated, and left behind without remorse. Eddie demands more complicated engagement. You're supposed to fear him throughout the vocational block sequence. The game's mechanics and his behavior justify that fear. But the ending asks you to also pity him, to recognize the tragedy underlying the horror, to understand that monsters are made through accumulated damage rather than spontaneously emerging from nowhere. It's uncomfortable and challenging, which is precisely what makes it effective. The broader implications of Eddie's story extend to questions about institutional responsibility and the ethics of psychiatric treatment. Mount Massive Asylum was supposed to care for the mentally ill, to provide treatment and containment for those too dangerous to exist in general society. Instead, it became a laboratory where the vulnerable were experimented on, where psychological damage was amplified rather than healed, where corporate profit motives trumped any pretense of medical ethics. Eddie entered that system as someone who needed help, someone whose childhood trauma had led to violent pathology, but who might have been contained or treated. The system failed him catastrophically, not through neglect but through deliberate exploitation. This raises questions that extend beyond the game's fiction into real-world concerns about psychiatric institutions, experimental treatments, and the rights of involuntary patients. History is full of examples where the mentally ill were subjected to experimental procedures without consent, where institutions became sites of abuse rather than healing, where profit and research goals overrode patient welfare. Outlast uses Eddie and the other variants to explore these concerns through horror gaming mechanics. But the underlying issues are real. What happens when institutions meant to protect the vulnerable instead exploit them? Who's accountable when treatment becomes torture? Where's the line between necessary research and unconscionable experimentation? The game doesn't preach or provide easy answers. It simply presents Eddie's story and lets players draw their own conclusions. But the implications are clear. He was failed by every system that should have protected him. His family failed him through abuse. The legal system failed him by sending him to Mount Massive. The medical establishment failed him by using his damage as experimental opportunity. And the result of all these failures was dozens of deaths, immense suffering, and a man who died in a flooded building still believing he was waiting for a wedding that would never come. Eddie Gluskin's legacy within horror gaming is significant. He represents a particular approach to antagonist design, where the most disturbing element isn't supernatural power or obvious evil, but recognizable human damage amplified to catastrophic levels. He's inspired analysis, discussion, and countless attempts by other developers to create similarly complex villains. The singing antagonist who maintains pleasant demeanor while committing atrocities has become something of a trope, though few implementations achieve the specific balance that makes Eddie work so effectively. Within Outlast's narrative, Eddie serves as proof of concept for what the morphogenic engine could do. If Murkoff could take someone like him and amplify his delusions to reality warping levels, imagine what they could do with subjects who had different psychological profiles. A soldier with protective instincts could become the perfect security asset. Someone with narcissistic tendencies could become an ideal corporate executive, completely convinced of their own rightness. The possibilities for exploitation were endless, which is why Murkoff invested so heavily in the technology despite the obvious ethical problems. The vocational block itself has become iconic within horror gaming spaces. Players remember navigating through Eddie's territory with a particular kind of dread, different from the adrenaline-spiking panic of Chris Walker's pursuits, or the visceral disgust of Traeger's traps. Eddie's section is oppressive in a psychological way because you're not just avoiding a threat, you're navigating through someone's disease fantasy made real. Every detail reinforces his delusion. Every corner could hide him waiting with that gentle smile and those terrible plans. Every step forward takes you deeper into a worldview that's completely divorced from sanity. The contrast between Eddie's appearance and his actions contributes to his effectiveness as an antagonist. He's not physically imposing like Chris Walker. He doesn't have Traeger's obviously deranged demeanor. He looks relatively normal, his wedding suit only slightly disheveled, his manner almost courteous. This makes him more disturbing because he violates expectations about what dangerous people look like. The game trains you to fear the obvious threats, the hulking masses of muscle, or the cackling sadists. Eddie teaches you that the most dangerous person might be the one who looks at you with genuine affection and calls you darling while planning your destruction. The moral ambiguity surrounding Eddie extends to questions about mental illness and criminal responsibility. If someone is sufficiently delusional that they genuinely cannot distinguish their fantasy from reality, are they responsible for crimes committed while in that state? Eddie truly believed he was preparing for his wedding, that his victims would become his perfect bride, that everything he did was in service of love rather than violence. Does his absolute conviction absolve him, or is the result the deaths and suffering he caused, what matters regardless of his mental state. These questions don't have clean answers, which is why Eddie's character generates so much discussion. The game's developers made careful choices about how much of Eddie's backstory to reveal. They provided enough information through documents and environmental storytelling for players to understand his origins, but they didn't over-explain. You learn about the childhood abuse, the false memories, the morphogenic engine sessions, but you're left to piece together the psychological journey from victimized child to the groom. This restraint makes Eddie more effective because it leaves space for player interpretation and imagination. Different people will emphasize different elements of his story, focus on different moments of his characterization, and come away with different understandings of who he was and what he represented. The symbolism of Eddie's surgical mutilations operates on multiple levels. On the surface, there's shock value horror, visceral violence that creates immediate player revulsion, but they also represent Eddie's attempts to literally reshape reality to match his desires, to force human bodies into forms that align with his internal fantasy. The surgeries are doomed to fail because you can't create genuine partnership through violation, can't manufacture love through violence, can't transform unwilling victims into willing participants no matter how much cutting and rearranging you do. Eddie's entire methodology is fundamentally flawed, but the delusion prevents him from recognizing this basic truth. The hanging bodies in the gymnasium serve as visual metaphor for the cost of delusion. Each corpse represents a moment when Eddie's fantasy collided with reality and reality lost. These were real people with their own lives reduced to components in someone else's impossible dream. They hang there as testament to what happens when one person's internal reality is given enough power to override everyone else's existence. It's a cautionary image about unchecked belief, about what happens when delusion is validated rather than challenged, about the human cost of allowing fantasy to consume fact. Eddie's relationship with other variants is barely explored in the game, but the implications are fascinating. Most of Mount Massive's inmates seem to fear or avoid him. There's no equivalent to the power struggle between Chris Walker and the Wall Rider. Eddie exists in his own bubble, his delusion so complete that he barely registers anything outside its boundaries. Other variants aren't potential allies or enemies, they're just irrelevant to his story. Unless they could serve as brides, they don't exist in his narrative. This isolation is another tragic element. Eddie is completely alone even when surrounded by other damaged people, because his internal reality has consumed everything. The music and singing that define Eddie's presence serve multiple functions. They create atmosphere, making his territory feel distinct from other areas of Mount Massive. They provide audio cues that help players track his location during pursuit sequences. But most importantly, they externalize his internal state. The songs Eddie chooses, romantic standards from the early 20th century, reveal what he's trying to create, what his delusion tells him is happening. When he sings about finding the perfect girl or getting married, he's narrating his fantasy in real time. The disconnect between the cheerful lyrics and the horrific context creates cognitive dissonance that makes the entire experience more unsettling. The final moment between Eddie and Waylon represents a rare instance of genuine human connection within Mount Massive's nightmarish environment. Throughout the rest of the game, interactions between characters are defined by predation, fear, violence, and exploitation. But when Eddie asks Waylon to stay, and Waylon agrees even briefly, something different happens. It's not forgiveness or redemption, it's recognition. One damaged person acknowledging another's pain, even across the barrier of their adversarial relationship. That moment suggests that even at the absolute bottom of human experience, even in the ruins of Mount Massive with everything falling apart, compassion remains possible if people choose it. Eddie Gluskin died as he lived, surrounded by the evidence of his failures, still believing in a fantasy that reality had repeatedly disproven, reaching out for connection that had always been impossible given his methods. His story is a tragedy in the classical sense, a protagonist with a fatal flaw that destroys him and others despite his inability to recognize or address it. The flaw wasn't his mental illness or his delusions. It was his absolute conviction that violence could create love, that destruction could build partnership, that he could manufacture through surgery what should emerge naturally from mutual respect and genuine connection. The legacy of the Groom extends beyond Outlast's immediate narrative. He represents something fundamental about horror gaming's evolution, the move away from supernatural threats and towards psychological realism. Eddie isn't scary because he has powers beyond human comprehension. He's scary because his damage is comprehensible, recognizable, an extreme amplification of real patterns of abuse and trauma. Anyone who studied psychology, worked in mental health, or simply paid attention to how trauma propagates across generations can see the mechanisms that created Eddie. That recognition makes him more disturbing than any demon or monster could be, because he's ultimately human, broken and terrible, but human nonetheless. In the end, Eddie Gluskin is the story of what happens when every safety net fails, when damage compounds across time until the person who emerges barely resembles who they might have been. He's a warning about institutional failure, corporate exploitation, and the long-term consequences of childhood abuse. He's a demonstration of how fantasy can consume reality when sufficiently empowered. And he's a tragedy, a person who could have been saved at multiple intervention points but never was, who became a monster because every system meant to prevent that outcome instead accelerated it. The gymnasium became Eddie Gluskin's final resting place. Impaled on the ceiling among the bodies, he'd hung there himself. The groom died believing that beauty had been within reach. His last words, "We could have been beautiful," summarized everything. The delusion that violence could create love, that surgical violation could manufacture partnership, that his perfect family was always one more victim away. The building continued to flood and collapse around his corpse. The vocational block, his carefully constructed wedding venue, became his tomb. The groom finally stopped singing.